Hello there, I'm Egil Thorson.
And I am Braggy.
And today we're going to be talking about food and drink. First thing, don't forget to press the subscription bell there up in the corner and leave us your comments. We will get back to you, but it does take a little bit of while. But as I say, we will definitely get back to you. Braggy.
So we're here today, we're going to talk about Viking food and drink. What was it like in the Dark Ages? And this is just a short introduction video into the subject. And at some point we'll make a much longer video on this subject if you want us to. So what are your thoughts on food and drink in the Dark Ages? What do you know, Egil?
Well, to be honest with you, people were mostly very, very hungry.
Were they?
In a dig in York, or in Yorkshire, we even found a badger skull that showed signs of people being eating it.
Really? We're eating badger? Yeah.
The only things they wouldn't eat were crows, ravens and carrion birds like that, because they were sacred birds of Odin.
Yes, you can understand that.
But also another myth I think we ought to dispel is people think they're Vikings there with great big pieces of meat.
Well, yes.
Yeah, I mean, meat was a luxury. It was around, but you couldn't just nip down to Tesco and get a little pat. You had to go out and kill it, and some of that meat didn't want killing, like wild boar. So. They'd eat bear, they'd eat all kinds of creatures. Mostly, though, you lived on a diet of grains and pulses. That was the most common diet. Not very sustaining, I suppose.
No, you mean having, bread and beans for your main diet, maybe a bit of cheese if you're lucky. Well, not a great diet, is it?
You see, the bread again, we found a loaf that had been burnt, and on analysis, it's difficult to say that, we found 29 different seeds.
Oh, that's a lot of seeds, yes.
Some of which are highly illegal today, but you used whatever you could. As for drink, well, yes, we talk about beer, but of course we forget about nettle beer.
Well, yes, that's one you forget about.
That the beer, everyday drinking would be about 2%. I mean, you imagine if you're making it 10, 12%.
Well, I think there'll be two cases. I think you'll have your weaker common ale, which will be a low percentage ale, your small beer, but then again, you'll also have your higher quality stuff.
That's for celebrations.
Yeah, for guests and
sitting down
and ceremonies and special occasions.
Oh yeah, I mean there are different classes of beer, but at the same time you can't drink 10% beer and expect to do your work.
Well, no, not unless you're like a well superb and well trained at drinking, then you might be able to handle it. But I think most people wouldn't have been.
No, I mean there's special occasions, but of course there's the old standby cider.
Well, that's another thing I'm about to talk about is fruit. We forget about fruit in the Dark Ages, and we'll talk about that.
Well, one thing when I was a student, and it quite surprised me, was the size of apples, and they're literally.
They're a lot smaller back in the day.
Yeah, and you ate the whole thing. Hence, we were able to analyse through the droppings of what people were eating. And
I do believe that there are still some types of apples still grown from the Dark Ages today.
Ah.
So we'll have to look into that. That'll be another subject, I think.
Any apple growers who want to send us some, please do.
Yes, it'll be interesting to taste and sample some Anglo-Saxon Viking style of apples.
Well, also plums and sloes. They were about a quarter the size they are, and they ate the whole thing.
Yes. Really?
And also remember, they didn't have potatoes.
No, well, people always forget that.
Yeah, I mean, we'd have leeks, a form of cabbage.
Well, we had the turnip. I mean, the turnip is lovely roasted.
No, it still is. It's lovely. And parsnips. I think they had parsnips anyway.
Yes, I did have parsnips.
But oats, these were the big things.
Well, barley would have been very common.
But oats feed your bloodstream, and you can. I mean, I like raw oats, but I can't eat them as porridge. I find it disgusting personally. But oats are a really good staple. The Romans brought them over, and they were adopted by the British, the Scots, who were famous for their porridge. Haggis also is a Viking invention.
Yes, I've read that before.
Jolly nice it is too.
We often forget that about haggis. I've not had any for a long time. Have you had haggis? Let us know.
We used to be able to buy it off the market, but there is a famous retailer I could tell you about later where you can get slices of it.
Now, of course, there's also dried meat. Because they would look to preserve things, wouldn't they?
Again, you've got dried meat, you have dried fish.
Yes.
The nearest you can get today, I think, is Haggis, which is Jamaican, which I've seen for sale on the market there. And the nice thing is, the Haggis, it sounds terrible, you leave it in water, so it then leaches the salt out. You put wild garlic in it, a bit of butter, you've got yourself a nice sauce to accompany it. And that's well within the remit of what you've got.
And of course, there's also that tradition of rotten meat. Used to keep seabirds in barrels until they'd rot. And they did the same with fish, didn't they, I believe? Yeah. And like with heron. And then they would eat them.
Well, there's that lutefisk, which is...
Yes.
I don't even like describing it.
Yes, well, not one day we would challenge to try that.
You can do it. I'll hold your coat.
All right. Thanks, Eggle.
Yeah, it's terrible stuff. It was described on the Travel Channel as tasting like fishy Vaseline, which doesn't endear it to me.
Vaseline's good for your lips, but that's that stuff, is.
Yeah, well, you can have that. But so you've got those. We also find hazelnuts.
Yes.
And they roasted them.
You can't beat roasted hazelnuts.
Yeah. Well, it's more digestible. Nettles, of course, were used.
Nettle soup.
Yeah.
Full of nutrients.
Yeah. And they would forage as well. I mean,
well, of course, the hedgerows were a very important source of food. You know, and we forget that.
But of course, this time of year would be a time of plenty, because there was a thing called trimilky that the Saxons had, where it's 3 milkings. And when winter comes, you select your best cattle that you can afford to keep, and the rest you slaughter. Well, it's far more than you can eat, so you have a big party. Hence, you get things like the Christmas feast, things like that, Easter time.
And if you went to the Longhouse, where would you be seeing the food?
You get things like hams and stuff like that. Probably near the fire would be the best, because the insect couldn't get to them.
And of course, then the meat would be smoked.
Yeah.
And be hanging from the rafters.
Well, you got massive racks of fish outside. But of course, you just said earlier what we call jerky today. Lasts indefinitely.
Well, it does last a long time.
It's a good... I personally love it, but they've had that around for years upon years, and it's still being made.
Well, it's probably one of the oldest forms of, preserving meat.
Yeah.
Drying it over fire.
And it works.
And it does last.
Yeah.
It's the same with hardtack. They didn't have any kind of equivalent to hardtack, did they?
As far as we know, not. But
well, that lasts for years.
But you see, this brings us on to a very subject. Is I studied under Dr. Jones, who is famous for his coprolitic
Bones Jones.
Yeah,
you may have heard about him before.
If you ever get the chance to go to one of his lectures, do it. It's fantastic. He is one of the greatest lecturers I've ever had the privilege of listening to. And whilst it sounds a horrible thing, I've dug coprolitic material, that's poo to the layman, and it goes like concrete, it mineralises.
Do you get a whiff or smell with it?
You sometimes get a smell from latrines, but not from the actual coprolitic material.
Really?
Depends on soil conditions. But you break it down with acid, and you can find out what people ate. The stomach parasites. We learnt a lot from that. And
lots of things like seed wouldn't digest, so they'll all be found in there, wouldn't they?
Well, we found a cherry stone in one, and there were mice teeth marks on it.
Oh, right.
So,
wow.
It sort of goes round and round and round. We find dog faeces, which has got big splinters of bone in it. Human ones were made up mostly of sort of bran and things like that. But nevertheless, very, very useful. It's like concrete when you find it. It's very strange stuff.
Now, they wouldn't eat their cats or dogs, would they?
Not as far as I know.
I never heard any accounts of that.
No, I haven't. I mean, cats especially were sacred to Freya.
Of course so, yes.
And
the nameless cats.
Well, in actual fact, the tabby cat is a direct Viking descendant. That came over, and they're like the pussycats like anyone else.
I mean, that's another idea for a video. We could talk about pets during the times of the Vikings.
Yeah.
Would you like to see that? Please let us know.
Yeah.
And how would you be eating your food? What would you have to eat it with, and what would you be eating it in?
your knife to start with. This is
Let me show that on camera a bit closer for them.
the stand. That is actually a rich man's knife.
That's a
They'll be
little
lot
eating
smaller.
knife. Show you that way
Yeah.
as well.
And
Eggle's also got some runes on it, look.
yeah, that's my name.
Eggle.
Rune Eggle. So you've got that. Spoons were in use, but mostly fingers. So you imagine you got meat in your mouth like that, and you cut it down. That's if you've got meat.
There's also that way of eating cheese and bread,
Oh.
where you have, I believe, a lump of bread here. We're going to demonstrate this one day. And you have your cheese in your back of your hand.
All right, that sounds
So
fun.
then you get your knife, you slice your cheese, you bite your cheese, you bite your bread, and you slice again.
I actually think I've seen a film.
I think that's a very old way of eating.
Yeah, I think I've seen people in Norfolk eating it like that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I may be imagining it, but
We too take in the modern world knives and forks for granted, and
well, I mean,
we've got hands.
forks were actually outlawed at one time by the Pope. I mean, it's after the Viking period as offensive weapons.
Really?
Oh yeah. Well, you look at the old forks and they're like these carving forks.
Yes.
Yeah. But I mean,
There's one over there.
there's the etiquette as well of eating.
Yes, of course.
You took the bread, you had the top part, and you ate off that, you flipped it round, and that's where you get from the upper crust, because only the rich would have the upper part, and the poor would have the lower crust.
Well, let's talk about that. Now, you're in a longhouse, and there's a feast going on, and they've got a number of tables set up. Where would we be on the table set up with our status?
Pretty high up. The Jarl would sit at the head, or the king, with his lady, and his bodyguard, his huscarls, would be behind him. You'd have a table probably a bit higher than everyone else's, but we would be probably at the high table, unless we're in very prestigious
Company, then you might be a little bit lower down the table.
In actual fact, we might even be bodyguards,
Indeed.
because the etiquette is you don't bring weapons.
No.
So swords, there was actually found racks for them. You can
That's
bring
interesting.
eating knives in. Now, also you notice the brooches, these long pins.
Yes.
And that was designed because if a man got a bit fresh with a lady, she'd take a pin out and ram it through his hand.
Ouch.
Yeah, it sort of dissuades them,
Yeah, but would do, yes.
because under the law that Alfred had, if a woman didn't fight for her virtue, then she deserved all she got,
No.
basically. So a man with a 4-inch spike in his hand would tend to calm down a tad.
So there we are. We're at the high end of the table, and we're getting the best quality of meat. We're getting venison and pork and beef, dried fish. But if you was poor and at the lower end of the table, what would you be having there?
It depends on the lord. If it's this time of year, this is a time of plenty, because you're getting the autumn fruits and vegetables, you're getting the cattle that have been killed off, and you'd get some pretty good food. The lean time, believe it or not, is summer and spring. That's when people really suffered, because you think about it, yes, there's beautiful blossom on the trees, but there ain't fruit, and your vegetables. So
I see that.
this is where the drying of meat and preservation of stuff. You could go to the river probably and get some fish, but you know, you're going to need a lot of fish to keep you going, aren't you?
We are going to need lots of fish, and if you're landlocked like we are in the county of Derbyshire, one of the 5 boroughs, then you may not have fish on your diet so much. You know, would you be wanting fish that's a couple of days old? I wouldn't.
And also, if you're a Jarl and you own that stretch of land with a river, you're not going to want strangers coming on your land taking fish, because that's fish you could eat or trade.
There's also, you know, natural water clams.
Yeah.
And there will be mussels, of course.
And I suppose you could go out, there'd be pigeons.
And we had no sugar, so what would they be using for sugar?
Honey.
Honey.
And that was very jealously guarded. I know that under Irish law, say you sell me some land with a hive on it, for 10 years I'd have to give you 1/3 of the honey.
Really?
And the king would get 1/3 and I would get 1/3, and that's for 10 years. So it shows you how honey has been viewed. You make it for drinks, yes, but it's also an antibiotic, but you probably wouldn't do it that for people.
Well, that's another subject I think we could probably talk about, because I do know quite a bit about beekeeping, and we could probably make a video on keeping bees in the Viking and Anglo-Saxon age.
Well, you used to keep them, didn't you?
Well, my dad used to.
Yeah.
But because I've grown up with that, I know a lot of information about beekeeping.
Some very nice honey you had as well.
It was very interesting what you're saying about how this bringing on some more of the worst seasons for food, because naturally you'd think that your winter would be your worst season.
Yeah.
You know, and you'd be preparing all summer and all your harvest for winter.
Yeah. But you're preparing your ground ready for planting. Blossom would look very pretty, but you can't eat blossom. I ate elderflower.
Elderflower, yes.
You can cook and fry, or you can make champagne, as they call it.
Well, a nice wine.
Yeah, and I think that's possibly. You also, of course, got your milk, which you can make cheese, which is
yes. We forget to mention cheese.
Yeah.
And also, they often have milk from sheep, which is something we don't think about today.
Sheep and goats.
Yes.
So, I mean, you could slaughter your sheep and goats. You could probably they've set that aside, but it's still a pretty rough time. Now, an interesting thing for all you people who are into the biology of the time, if you get a human skull, look at where the gum line was, and you'll see, if you see a white ridge, that means that person has suffered malnutrition. If you can imagine, here we are, Bragi, he's doing all right with himself, and the harvest fails. He has enough food to keep him going, but if you can imagine your tooth like a tree, every year has a ring of enamel.
Well, of course so, yes.
This year, it's hard times. He's barely able to be alive, but he survives. Next year, the harvest comes in and he's away. But from that tooth, he will bear that mark forever, whilst that tooth survives. And I've looked at skulls from this period right up to 19th century, and they've all got that little white band. And it's a bit of a sobering thought to think we're, what, 3 meals away from starvation.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
We live in such a very padded sort of world.
Well, you know, if there was ever a big disaster on the planet, you know, people would be starving in 3-4 weeks.
Yeah,
you know, that's true.
Yeah, I mean, also another problem that they would have had, which they didn't know about, is of course ergo. And that is the wheat, when it's damp and sunny, creates a mould.
Yes.
That mould is a natural LSD.
That's ergo of rye.
Yeah. And there was a case in France where people were jumping out of windows thinking they could fly. And that was because they'd eaten this bread. They also reckon that the Salem witches were...
Yes, I'm about to say that some of the witch trials were associated with accidentally eating ergo, but
we'll probably take
it's
that
a
with
very
a pinch of
hallucinogenic.
salt. It just, there's
very hallucinogenic. I'm trying to think of the word there, I can't.
Yeah, they went on a massive trip.
And you know, if you ever try to look one from the field, it will take you forever.
Yeah, well, I mean, also
people do.
This is something that other people forget, is there are hallucinogenic mushrooms.
Well, of course so.
And of course, the famous one in the fairy stories is phlegaric, which was picked by the runic priests, and they knew exactly if you took too much, you're dead.
Of course so, yes.
But I remember a story of somebody drinking phlegaric mead, and they saw a dragon, which is quite possible, but don't try it. Please.
No, it's very dangerous. But of course, another thing we forget about is foraging in the woods. You know, the amount of mushrooms out there. But unless you're a layman and you know exactly what you're doing, I do not recommend going out picking mushrooms.
Even with books, you want somebody who knows it.
Definitely.
My brother-in-law, for instance, he knows a good mushroom.
Well, you can get a death cap very easily confused with another mushroom, which is available to be ate, and then you just poison yourself very, very badly.
Well, I mean, there's these famous puff balls.
Yes.
You slice them, dip them in egg and breadcrumbs and fry them. Yeah, they fried food, we know that. We found remains of frying pans, ceramic ones. Oat and bran cakes were another thing they'd eat. You remember from your days in Regia, they used to make oat cakes.
Yes, just don't burn them.
Yeah, as Alfred found out to his cost. But Yeah, and there's the fruits on the trees.
Yes, we always forget the fruits.
Yeah. I mean, you've got blackberries.
I mean, people must have been very busy all the time with preparing food.
If you notice, well, my granny, she never sat there doing nothing. She was either knitting or doing something, even if you're talking to her. And that's a tradition that's come from the past. Nowadays, you know, you see people just sitting there doing nothing. But even up to my grandparents' time, you were knitting or you were making, like granddad repaired a clock or he'd repair shoes, things like that. Little tasks that make life easier for you. And,
well, there was always things wanting repairing in those days.
Well, there's the old saying, isn't there? The devil finds...
work for idle hands.
Yeah, and it's that tradition of spinning, weaving and various other things.
Yes, well, let's summarise this video and we'll end it up. So, you want to summarise it about food in Viking Age food and drink?
It wasn't as bad as people would make out. It was lean times, if you like. It didn't take much for you to end up starving, but at the same time, the average Viking had a pretty bland diet, but it kept them upright. If you were lordly, like us two, you lived a pretty good life.
It'll be interesting to actually compare the amount of calories.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something we'll probably never know what average Viking would have ate compared to today. Would they be eating more calories than us?
I would compare it with a modern infantryman. A modern infantryman has 3,000 calories, and that's about what they would aim for. They might hit it occasionally, they might not. They might even exceed it sometimes. Depends on the weather, literally. So...
That's very interesting and a fascinating chat. We've been going on for 20 minutes now.
Well, so if anybody out there has anything to add to that, please let us know.
Yes, please leave a comment.
I'm sure there's many Dark Age cook out there who can give us some tips. Hey, maybe they can leave us recipes.
Well, no, somewhere I do have a massive pile of Dark Age, Anglo-Saxon and Viking recipes.
That sounds good.
I just don't know where it is at the moment. It's above me, it's in the attic.
Yeah, that's a bit like finding a needle in a haystack.
Yes, and on that point, we are going to say goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye. And what should they do, Eggle?
And
leave a comment.
Yeah.
And if you're new to the channel, then please feel free to go and subscribe. By doing that, you'll be notified when we publish, when we premiere, but also when we live stream, which we must do again soon. Goodbye.
Happy eating, happy drinking.
Was hail.
Was hail.
Drink was hail.